The family I nanny for has a hand signal for danger, and the kids used it when their uncle came to pick them up. The doorbell rang at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon while I was helping 7-year-old Chloe with her spelling homework, and her brother Ethan was building a tower with blocks on the living room floor. I'd been working for the Brennan family for 5 months, caring for the kids every weekday from 3 when they got home from school until 7, when their mother Julia arrived from her job as a nurse at County Hospital. The kids were sweet and well-behaved, and Julia was organized and appreciative, always leaving detailed notes about schedules and emergency contacts. But there was an underlying tension in the house I'd noticed from day one, a hypervigilance in how Julia triple-checked locks and asked me to text her photos of the kids every hour. When I'd asked about it during my interview, she'd explained vaguely that they'd had some family troubles, and she needed to know her children were safe. Then she taught me the hand signal. If either child ever touched their left ear with their right hand crossing over their head, it meant they felt unsafe and needed help, but couldn't say it out loud. She'd made me practice recognizing it and promised to explain more when the time was right. That time apparently arrived when I opened the front door and found a man in his 30s with sandy hair and a friendly smile saying he was Julia's brother coming to pick up the kids. He introduced himself as Ryan Brennan and explained that Julia had asked him to get Chloe and Ethan because she'd been called into an emergency surgery and wouldn't be home until late. He apologized for the short notice and said Julia had tried calling me, but my phone must have been on silent. I immediately checked my phone and saw no missed calls, which made my stomach tighten with the first hint of concern. Ryan seemed to notice my hesitation and pulled out his driver's license showing his name matched what he'd told me, then showed me a text message thread with someone listed as Jules, where she'd supposedly asked him to pick up the kids. The text looked legitimate and his explanation was reasonable, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I told him to wait a moment while I checked with the kids, and he smiled patiently and said, "Of course, family safety was important." I walked back into the living room where Chloe and Ethan had both stopped what they were doing and were staring toward the front door with expressions I couldn't quite read. I asked if they knew their Uncle Ryan and both nodded slowly. Then Chloe reached up with her right hand and touched her left ear, the movement deliberate and unmistakable. My heart started pounding immediately because Julia had been clear that this signal meant genuine danger, not just discomfort or shyness. Ethan was 5 and sometimes copied his sister, but he made the same gesture independently, his small hand reaching across his face to tap his ear 3 times. Both children were giving me the danger signal about their own uncle, and I had maybe 30 seconds to decide what to do before Ryan would expect me to bring them to the door. I forced my expression to stay neutral and told the kids in a bright, casual voice to keep playing for just a minute while I talked to their uncle. Then I walked back to the door and told Ryan through the screen that I needed to verify with Julia directly before releasing the children to anyone, which was household policy. Ryan's friendly expression flickered for just a moment before resetting to patient understanding. He said that made sense and he'd wait right here while I called Julia, pulling out his phone to check messages. I closed the front door and locked it, then immediately called Julia's cell phone with shaking hands. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail, which was unusual because she always answered when I called during work hours, knowing it would be about the kids. I tried the hospital directly and asked to page Julia Brennan in surgery. The operator said there was no Julia Brennan on staff in the surgical unit, and checked the schedule showing she wasn't working today at all. My blood went cold as I realized Ryan had lied about the emergency surgery. I tried Julia's phone 3 more times while watching Ryan through the front window. He was pacing on the porch and checking his watch, his body language shifting from patient to agitated. On the 4th attempt, Julia answered breathless and panicked, saying she was in her car and what was wrong. I told her quickly that someone claiming to be her brother Ryan was at the house trying to pick up the kids, that I'd verified she wasn't at the hospital, and that both children had used the hand signal. Julia made a sound between a gasp and a sob, and told me not to let him anywhere near the kids, that she was calling the police immediately, and was 20 minutes away. She said Ryan wasn't actually her brother, he was her ex-husband's brother, and there was a custody order prohibiting anyone from his family from contact with the children. She said she'd explain everything when she got there, but I needed to keep the doors locked and keep the kids away from windows. Ryan must have heard my voice getting louder through the door because he started knocking hard and calling out that there was no need for drama. Julia had sent him and the kids needed to come with him right now. I told Julia that Ryan was getting aggressive and she said the police were on their way, to stay inside no matter what he said or threatened. I hung up and gathered both kids, taking them upstairs to Chloe's bedroom, which faced the backyard rather than the street where Ryan was. Chloe was crying silently, and Ethan was clinging to my leg asking if the bad man was going to take them away. I knelt down and told them both that their mom was coming and the police were coming, and I wasn't going to let anyone take them anywhere. Chloe asked in a small voice if I knew why Uncle Ryan was bad, and I said I didn't know the details yet, but I trusted their signal and their mom's instructions. She told me that Uncle Ryan had helped their dad try to take them before, that he'd shown up at their school last year pretending to be an approved pickup person, until teachers recognized him from the banned list. She said their dad wasn't allowed to see them because he'd hurt their mom and had threatened to disappear with them to another country where their mom couldn't find them. Ethan added that his dad had told him that mommies who worked too much didn't deserve their kids, that children should be with their fathers who knew how to take care of them properly. The casual way these young children discussed parental abduction and domestic violence made me feel sick, but I kept my voice calm and reassuring. Ryan stopped knocking and everything went quiet for about 30 seconds. Then I heard breaking glass downstairs and realized he'd smashed a window to get inside. I pulled both kids into Chloe's closet and told them to be absolutely silent. Then I called 911 and whispered that there was an intruder in the house attempting to abduct 2 children with an active custody order. The dispatcher said units were already en route based on Julia's call and were less than 5 minutes away, that I should hide and not confront the intruder. I could hear Ryan's footsteps on the stairs, hear him calling out that he knew the kids were here and this was ridiculous. Their father just wanted to see them and had every right as their parent. He was trying to sound reasonable and frustrated rather than threatening, probably aware that neighbors might hear. I positioned myself between the closet door and the bedroom door, looking around for anything I could use as a weapon. Chloe's room had a softball bat in the corner and I grabbed it, my hands slippery with sweat. Ryan's footsteps reached the top of the stairs and I heard him opening doors, checking the bathroom and Ethan's room before heading toward Chloe's room where we were hiding. The bedroom door opened and Ryan stepped inside, his expression hardening when he saw me standing there with the bat. He told me I was making a huge mistake, interfering with a family matter I didn't understand, that the kid's father had been railroaded by a vindictive ex-wife and the courts had been biased against him. He said Julia had poisoned the kids against their own father, and now she was turning employees into accomplices in parental alienation. His voice was rising and his face was flushed, and I could see rage building beneath his attempt at reasoned argument. I told him the police were already on their way and he needed to leave immediately. Ryan laughed and said police always took the mother's side in custody disputes, that fathers had no rights in this country, that his brother had every legal and moral claim to his own children. He took a step toward me and I raised the bat, telling him I'd use it if he came closer. He called me a naive girl who was going to get sued for assault and kidnapping, that I had no authority to keep children from their family. Then he lunged toward the closet door and I swung the bat hard, catching him in the ribs. He stumbled backward with a grunt of pain and surprise, and sirens became audible in the distance, getting rapidly louder. Ryan's face twisted with fury and calculation. He looked toward the closet where the kids were hiding, then toward the window, then back at me with the bat. The sirens were right outside now and I heard car doors slamming and officers shouting to announce their presence. Ryan swore viciously and ran out of the room, thundering down the stairs. I heard him trying to go out the back door, but officers were already coming through, ordering him to get on the ground. There were shouts and scuffling sounds and then silence. I opened the closet door and both kids rushed out, wrapping their arms around me and sobbing. I held them and told them it was over. They were safe. Their mom would be here any second. Chloe kept saying, "You saw the signal," over and over, and I realized how terrified she'd been that I might ignore it or not understand. A female police officer came upstairs with her weapon holstered, introducing herself as Officer Denise Park. She checked all 3 of us for injuries and called down to her partners that the children were secure and unharmed. She explained that Ryan had been arrested attempting to flee and was being taken into custody for breaking and entering, attempted custodial interference, and violation of a protection order. Julia arrived 5 minutes later, running up the stairs and pulling both kids into her arms, checking their faces and bodies for any sign of harm. She was crying and thanking me over and over, saying I'd saved her children's lives, that Ryan and his brother had been trying to abduct them for over a year. Officer Park took statements from everyone while more police arrived to document the broken window and search the house. Julia explained the full situation to the officers while I held Chloe and Ethan on the couch. Julia's ex-husband, Thomas Brennan, was the father of both children and had been abusive throughout their marriage, primarily through financial control and emotional manipulation, but escalating to physical violence after Julia filed for divorce 3 years ago. The final incident that led to the divorce involved Thomas grabbing Ethan so roughly he'd left bruises on the boy's arms, and Child Protective Services had been called by the pediatrician who documented the injuries. The family court had granted Julia full legal and physical custody, with Thomas getting only supervised visitation that he'd rarely utilized. Instead of accepting the custody arrangement, Thomas had become obsessed with taking the children completely, convinced that the courts were biased against fathers, and that Julia had manipulated the system. He'd filed dozens of frivolous motions trying to get custody reversed, hired multiple attorneys who'd eventually dropped him as a client, and made increasingly explicit threats about taking the kids and disappearing to his brother's property in Montana. The final straw had come 6 months ago, when Thomas and Ryan had shown up at the children's elementary school claiming to be there for a scheduled pickup. The school office had verified against their approved pickup list and refused to release the children, but Thomas had tried to force his way into the building before security escorted him out and called police. That incident had led to a restraining order prohibiting Thomas or any member of his family from contacting Julia or the children, from coming within 500 feet of their home or school, and from making any attempt to communicate with or retrieve the children. Officer Park verified all of this through her computer system and said the restraining order was active and Thomas had been notified of its terms. She said Ryan's attempted pickup today was a clear violation and would result in serious charges. Detective Warren Price from the Family Crimes Unit arrived an hour later and interviewed everyone again in more detail. He was in his 50s with gray hair and weary eyes that suggested he'd worked too many cases involving children caught in adult warfare. He asked me to describe exactly what happened from the moment Ryan arrived, and I walked him through every detail, including the hand signal, the fake texts, the lies about emergency surgery, and the kids' frightened reaction to their uncle's presence. Detective Price showed me Ryan's phone, which they'd seized during arrest, and the text messages supposedly from Julia were there, but investigation showed they'd been created using a spoofing app that let Ryan send himself fake messages to make his story look legitimate. He'd researched my work schedule and Julia's typical patterns, had known exactly when to show up to maximize chances of success. Detective Price said this level of planning indicated premeditation and suggested Thomas and Ryan had been coordinating this for weeks or months. He asked if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial, and I said absolutely, whatever the kids needed. Julia's lawyer arrived around 7 that evening, a sharp woman named Patricia Valdez who specialized in family law and custody disputes. She'd been representing Julia throughout the divorce and custody battle and knew every detail of Thomas's escalating behavior. Patricia explained that this incident would strengthen the restraining order and potentially result in Thomas losing even his supervised visitation rights if the court determined he'd been involved in planning the abduction attempt. She said Ryan would face serious criminal charges and might implicate Thomas in exchange for a plea deal, which could give them evidence to pursue charges against Thomas as well for conspiracy to commit custodial interference. The kids stayed up late that night, too wired and frightened to sleep despite their exhaustion. Julia ordered pizza, and we all sat in the living room with extra lights on and the curtains drawn. Chloe kept asking questions about what would happen to Uncle Ryan and whether their dad would try again. Julia answered honestly but gently, explaining that Uncle Ryan would probably go to jail, that they were taking more security measures to keep everyone safe, and that some adults made very bad choices, but that didn't mean the children had done anything wrong. Ethan fell asleep eventually on Julia's lap while Chloe dozed against my shoulder. Julia looked at me with red eyes and said she'd planned to tell me everything about the situation weeks ago, but kept putting it off, worried that if I knew the full extent of the danger, I'd quit. She said good nannies were hard to find and she couldn't afford to lose childcare, but she realized now that keeping me partially informed had been selfish and dangerous. I told her I understood the impulse to protect everyone, but I needed to know the whole truth going forward if I was going to keep working for them. Julia agreed and spent the next hour telling me everything about her marriage, divorce, Thomas's deteriorating mental state, his family's enabling of his obsessive behavior, and the ongoing legal battle that had cost her nearly $50,000 in attorney fees. Thomas Brennan came from a wealthy family who saw Julia as lower class and unworthy of their son. Thomas had been charming and successful when they'd met, a financial analyst with a good salary and family connections. But marriage and children had triggered controlling behaviors that escalated over 7 years. He'd insisted on controlling all finances, giving Julia an allowance and requiring her to account for every purchase. He'd criticized her parenting constantly, undermining her authority with the kids and telling them mommy didn't know how to take proper care of them. He'd isolated her from friends and family, using jealousy and accusations to limit her social connections. When Julia had finally started working as a nurse to have her own income and independence, Thomas had seen it as betrayal, and his control tactics had intensified. The physical violence had started small, grabbing her arm too hard during arguments, pushing her during disagreements, until the incident with Ethan where he'd lost his temper completely and hurt his own son. Julia had filed for divorce immediately, and Thomas had never forgiven her, convinced she'd stolen his children and destroyed his life through malicious lies. His family had supported his narrative, hiring expensive lawyers and private investigators to build a case that Julia was an unfit mother. But the evidence kept favoring Julia because she actually was a good mother, and Thomas's behavior in court kept demonstrating exactly why he shouldn't have custody. Over the following weeks, the legal proceedings moved forward. Ryan Brennan was charged with multiple felonies including breaking and entering, attempted custodial interference, stalking, and violation of a protection order. His bail was set at $200,000, which his wealthy family posted immediately despite Patricia's objections. Detective Price said that was concerning because Ryan out on bail meant he could potentially coordinate with Thomas for another attempt. Julia installed a comprehensive security system with cameras at every entrance and panic buttons in multiple rooms. I started parking in the garage rather than the street so no one could track my arrival times. The kids began therapy with Dr. Michelle Ortega, a psychologist specializing in children experiencing parental conflict and domestic violence. Dr. Ortega said both kids showed signs of anxiety and hypervigilance appropriate for children who'd lived in a threatening environment, but they were resilient and would benefit from continued stability and security. Chloe told Dr. Ortega about the hand signal and how proud she'd felt that it had worked, that an adult had actually listened and protected them when they signaled danger. Dr. Ortega said empowering children with safety tools was valuable, but shouldn't be their only protection, that adults needed to maintain vigilant awareness rather than relying on kids to identify threats. The preliminary hearing for Ryan's criminal charges happened 6 weeks after the incident. I had to testify about what I'd witnessed, walking the court through Ryan's arrival, his false claims, the kids' hand signals, Julia's phone call, and Ryan's break-in, and attempted access to the children. Ryan's defense attorney tried to portray it as a misunderstanding, claiming Ryan had genuinely believed Julia wanted him to pick up the kids and had panicked when confronted by police. But the fake text messages, the lies about emergency surgery, and the breaking and entering undermined his story. the judge found probable cause for all charges and ordered Ryan to remain subject to the existing restraining order with additional conditions prohibiting any contact with me as a witness. Patricia used the hearing outcome to file an emergency motion with family court requesting termination of Thomas's parental rights based on his documented involvement in planning the abduction attempt. Detective Price's investigation had revealed phone records showing 37 calls between Thomas and Ryan in the week before the incident, plus text messages discussing my schedule and Julia's work patterns. Thomas had provided Ryan with detailed intelligence about the family's routines and security measures, making him an active co-conspirator even though he hadn't been physically present. The family court hearing on Patricia's motion was scheduled for 3 months later, giving both sides time to prepare arguments and evidence. Thomas's attorney was Maxwell Fremont, an expensive family law specialist known for representing fathers in custody disputes and portraying mothers as vindictive and manipulative. Fremont filed a counter-motion claiming Julia had manufactured the entire abduction attempt as a pretext to eliminate Thomas from the children's lives, that Ryan had been acting innocently, and Julia had coached the kids to use the hand signal to frame an innocent uncle. The accusation was outrageous given the documented evidence, but Fremont was skilled at creating doubt and sympathy for his clients. Patricia said we needed to prepare for an aggressive cross-examination where Fremont would try to discredit my testimony by suggesting I'd misinterpreted the children's signals or conspired with Julia to fabricate the threat. Julia was terrified that despite everything, the court might still give Thomas some form of access to the children. She'd seen too many cases where abusive fathers maintained custody or visitation rights because courts prioritized parental rights over children's safety. Patricia assured her that the evidence was overwhelming and this judge, Honorable Sandra Kimball, had a reputation for taking domestic violence and child safety seriously, but nothing in family court was guaranteed. I continued working for the Brennan family throughout this period, my role evolving from nanny to something more complex. The kids needed consistency, and I provided it, maintaining their normal routines while their mother navigated legal proceedings. Chloe started having nightmares about men breaking into the house, and I'd spend nights sleeping on an air mattress in her room when Julia worked overnight shifts at the hospital. Ethan developed separation anxiety and cried every time Julia left for work, needing extensive reassurance that she'd come back. Dr. Ortega said these were normal responses to traumatic events and would improve with time and security. Julia's friends and family rallied around her, but many didn't fully understand the danger or complexity of the situation. Her sister kept suggesting Julia should try to work things out with Thomas for the kids' sake, that children needed fathers and maybe Thomas would calm down if Julia was more cooperative. Julia eventually stopped talking to her sister because that attitude minimized everything she and the kids had survived. Her mother was more supportive but lived 3 states away and could only help through phone calls and occasional visits. The isolation of fighting this battle was evident in Julia's exhausted face and the way she sometimes just sat staring at nothing between tasks. The week before the family court hearing, Thomas escalated again. Someone slashed Julia's tires in the hospital parking lot overnight while she was working. Security cameras showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap, but the footage wasn't clear enough to identify them definitively. Patricia filed a police report and requested additional security measures, but without proof of who had done it, there were no arrests. 2 days later, someone left a dead rat on the front porch with a note saying, "Mothers who steal children deserve what they get." Julia called Detective Price, who documented everything and added it to Thomas's file, but again there was no direct evidence linking him to the intimidation. The pattern was clear, though. Someone was trying to frighten Julia into dropping the custody proceedings, or at least demonstrate she couldn't keep her family safe. Julia refused to be intimidated and instead became more determined. She told me that abusers relied on victims giving up, getting tired, running out of money for lawyers and security measures. Thomas's family had resources to fund legal battles indefinitely, but Julia had something stronger. She was fighting for her children's safety rather than her own ego, and that gave her motivation that couldn't be purchased. The family court hearing arrived on a cold morning in late October. The courtroom was smaller and less formal than criminal court, designed for family matters with tables for attorneys and clients rather than witness stands. Judge Kimball was a black woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor. She'd reviewed all the documents in advance and started the hearing by noting that this was a serious matter involving documented threats to children's safety, and she expected both sides to present evidence and arguments professionally. Patricia went first, methodically walking through the history of Thomas's abuse, the divorce proceedings, the custody order, his refusal to accept court decisions, the restraining order violations, and the attempted abduction coordinated with his brother. She presented phone records, text messages, security footage, police reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses, including me. I testified about the kids' hand signals and their visible fear when Ryan had appeared, about his false claims and aggressive behavior, about finding broken glass and realizing he'd broken in to reach the children. Maxwell Fremont cross-examined me extensively, suggesting I was young and inexperienced and might have misunderstood innocent gestures as distress signals, that children sometimes acted dramatically without real reason. I held firm in my testimony, explaining that both children had made the identical gesture independently within seconds of each other, that they'd been taught this specific signal by their mother for exactly this type of situation, and that their fear had been genuine and immediate. Fremont asked if Julia had ever told me negative things about Thomas, or planted ideas that he was dangerous. I said Julia had explained there was a custody dispute and restraining order, but had never coached me to interpret the children's behavior in any particular way, that my responses had been based on what I witnessed directly. Fremont seemed frustrated that he couldn't rattle me and moved on to questioning Julia about her motivations for requesting termination of parental rights. Julia explained calmly that Thomas had demonstrated he valued control and possession of the children more than their well-being, that he'd repeatedly violated court orders and safety measures, and that the attempted abduction proved he would stop at nothing to take the children from her. She said she'd tried for years to facilitate some relationship between Thomas and the kids despite the divorce, but his behavior had made it impossible and dangerous. She provided documentation of every missed supervised visitation appointment, every threatening message, every instance where Thomas had prioritized his grievances over his children's needs. Thomas took the stand and presented himself as a reasonable father who'd been victimized by a biased system and a vindictive ex-wife. He claimed he'd never abused anyone, that Julia had manipulated incidents to look worse than they were, that his brother Ryan had made an honest mistake that Julia had blown out of proportion. He said the restraining order was excessive and had been based on Julia's false allegations, that he was a successful professional with no criminal history who just wanted to be part of his children's lives. Maxwell Fremont elicited sympathetic testimony about how painful it was to be separated from your own kids, how fathers were discriminated against in family court, how Thomas had tried everything to maintain a relationship, but been thwarted at every turn. The performance was convincing enough that I could see why some people believed him. Thomas was articulate and composed, showing no sign of the rage and obsession documented in police reports and witness statements. Judge Kimball listened impassively, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Thomas finished testifying, she asked him directly about the phone calls with Ryan in the week before the attempted pickup. Thomas claimed they'd been discussing family matters unrelated to the children, that any mention of schedules had been innocent conversation. Judge Kimball asked why he'd provided Ryan with detailed information about his ex-wife's work patterns and the nanny's schedule if he wasn't planning anything. Thomas said he didn't recall those specific details and might have mentioned things casually without any malicious intent. Patricia's rebuttal was devastating. She played excerpts from voicemail messages Thomas had left Julia over the past year, his voice escalating from controlled anger to screaming rage, threatening to take the children where she'd never find them, calling her worthless and telling her she'd regret destroying his family. She presented emails where Thomas had told his brother that Julia didn't deserve the kids and they needed to do whatever necessary to get them back. She showed text messages where Thomas had researched countries without extradition treaties with the United States, where parental abduction wouldn't result in children being returned. The evidence painted a picture of someone not interested in co-parenting or his children's welfare, but in punishing Julia and asserting dominance. Judge Kimball's expression grew colder as Patricia presented each piece of evidence, and I could see Maxwell Fremont realizing his client had lied to him about the extent of his behavior. The judge called a brief recess, then returned and delivered her ruling from the bench without needing time for written deliberations. She said the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated that Thomas posed a serious threat to the children's safety and well-being, that his behavior showed escalating obsession and willingness to violate court orders, and that maintaining any parental rights would put the children at ongoing risk. Judge Kimball terminated Thomas's parental rights entirely, stating that this was an extraordinary measure reserved for circumstances where a parent has demonstrated through clear and convincing evidence that they prioritize their own agenda over their children's welfare and safety. She said Thomas had had multiple opportunities to demonstrate he could put his children first and had instead chosen to pursue increasingly dangerous courses of action. The termination meant Thomas would have no legal relationship to Chloe and Ethan, no custody, no visitation, no right to information about their lives, school, or medical care. He would retain the obligation to pay child support, but would have no parental authority whatsoever. Thomas stood up and started shouting that this was illegal, and he'd appeal, and she was corrupt and biased against fathers. Judge Kimball ordered him to sit down and be quiet or be held in contempt. When Thomas continued yelling, security officers escorted him from the courtroom while he screamed that Julia had stolen his children and would pay for what she'd done. The entire scene demonstrated exactly why the judge's ruling had been correct, showing Thomas's inability to control his emotions or prioritize his children's experience over his own rage. Julia sobbed with relief once we left the courthouse, Patricia holding her steady while she processed what had just happened. 3 years of fear and legal battles had culminated in the strongest possible protection, total termination of the abuser's parental rights. Patricia said appeals were possible but unlikely to succeed given the overwhelming evidence and Judge Kimball's detailed findings. Thomas would have to demonstrate significant changed circumstances to even get a hearing, and judges were reluctant to reverse termination decisions. The immediate effect was that Thomas could no longer use the family court system to continue harassing Julia, couldn't file motions or request custody modifications, couldn't drag them back to court every few months. That legal harassment had been almost as damaging as the physical threats, costing Julia money and emotional energy and forcing her to constantly revisit her trauma. Now that avenue was closed completely. Ryan's criminal trial happened 2 months later, and he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years in prison. As part of his plea agreement, he provided testimony about Thomas's role in planning the abduction attempt, confirming that Thomas had detailed my schedule, Julia's work patterns, and suggested the fake emergency surgery story. Based on Ryan's testimony, Detective Price arrested Thomas and charged him with conspiracy to commit custodial interference, criminal solicitation, and witness intimidation related to the tire slashing and dead rat incidents. Thomas's criminal trial was scheduled for the following year, but his expensive attorney negotiated a plea deal where Thomas pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received a sentence of 3 years in prison plus 5 years probation with conditions prohibiting any contact with Julia or the children. The plea deal avoided a lengthy trial and guaranteed Thomas would face some consequences without requiring the kids to testify. Patricia said it was a reasonable outcome, even if she would have preferred longer prison time, because the conviction meant Thomas now had a felony record that would affect his employment and make any future custody claims impossible. Life slowly began to normalize for the Brennan family after the legal proceedings concluded. Chloe and Ethan continued therapy and their anxiety symptoms gradually decreased. Chloe stopped having nightmares about intruders and Ethan's separation anxiety improved to the point where he could say goodbye to Julia without crying. They both understood at their age-appropriate level that their father had made very bad choices and wouldn't be part of their lives anymore, that this wasn't their fault and they were loved and safe. Dr. Ortega said children were remarkably resilient when provided with stability and security, and both kids were demonstrating healthy coping mechanisms and emotional processing. I continued working for Julia for another 2 years before graduating college and moving across the country for a job. The goodbye was emotional for all of us because I'd become woven into their family during the crisis and aftermath. Chloe and Ethan made me cards and gave me a framed photo of the 3 of us at Ethan's 7th birthday party. Julia wrote me a letter thanking me for seeing the hand signal and taking it seriously, for protecting her children when it mattered most, for testifying even though it was difficult and time-consuming. She said many people would have ignored the signal or dismissed the kids' fear as shyness or overreaction, that my willingness to trust their communication had literally saved them from abduction. She said the hand signal system had been a tool she'd hoped would never be needed, but was grateful it existed when the crisis arrived. Julia added that she'd learned from this experience that you couldn't always predict where safety and protection would come from, that sometimes a 22-year-old nanny who barely knew the family would be the one standing between your children and danger. That lesson had changed how she thought about building support systems and trusting people. Years later, I still think about that afternoon when the doorbell rang and Ryan stood on the porch with his rehearsed story and fake text messages. I think about how easily I could have believed him and handed over the kids, how the tragedy would have unfolded if Chloe and Ethan hadn't known the hand signal, or if I hadn't been taught to recognize it. I think about the courage it took for those young children to use the signal, even though they were terrified, trusting that an adult would actually respond appropriately. And I think about Julia's determination to protect her kids despite every obstacle and expense, fighting a system that often favors parental rights over children's safety. That experience shaped how I approach situations where children might be at risk, taught me to take kids' communications seriously even when they're nonverbal or indirect, to trust behavioral signals that indicate fear or distress. The hand signal worked exactly as designed, and sometimes that's the difference between safety and catastrophe. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.